What's up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Real Estate. And today we have Steve Quigley with Veteran Inspection Group. So they do commercial and residential inspections. So welcome, Steven. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Josh.
So I figured the best way to start out today would be let's talk about some of the things you guys do and what you're looking out for, what a lot of people don't know to look out for in homes or commercial buildings, or if they're buying a business. A lot of people are looking to do that now. So what would you say are the big things you guys are usually looking for?
The biggest things are always going to be structural, mechanical. We don't really pay a whole lot of attention to cosmetic or aesthetic things.
What would be cosmetic or aesthetic?
Drywall cracks, tape seams, things like that, bad paint, bad flooring, things like that. So we're looking at HVAC, plumbing, electrical, roof systems, structural components, things like that. All of your bigger ticket items.
Okay. Right? What are the things that usually are the biggest issues, would you say?
Anything water related is always a big issue,
right?
So we always kind of break things down into, especially when we're talking with a client, what are your big ticket items? Big ticket items is anything that's going to be water related.
Okay.
A roof expense and HVAC expense are going to be, as far as monetary costs, are going to be up there. But we always talk about the importance of, if there's a water issue, make sure you resolve that. Water can
Pretty
kill
quickly.
the structure quicker than anything.
Right.
Absolutely.
Where would, let's say a roof, what are the biggest things you see leaking on a roof?
Usually it's the penetration points, whether it's flashing or plumbing boots or, a scupper system on a commercial building. It's anywhere where you have a penetration or where you have two structures that are adjoining on a roof structure. There's always going to be that, that adjoining area that has a seam.
Okay. So like the seal's broken or nail pop or something like that?
Nail pops can always lead to a leak. You can lead to a small leak. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
When you guys are looking at like the attics? Are you getting on the roof? How are you figuring that stuff out?
So a lot of times we can tell the condition of a roof based on the condition of the attic system. So if we don't have enough ventilation, is a good indicator. You can see moisture forming in the attic system. Carrying moisture meters around, you can always tell if a leak is current. So we always like to look at the roof from the underside first.
Okay.
And if we can access the roof, we're going to get on the roof. If not, we have drone capability. We're going to drone will video and take high definition photographs, which basically are just as good as my eyes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So from the standpoint of, I know like that's a big one more often than not, like what should like a homeowner keep an eye out for? I know like when we walk in, we're looking at the ceiling, see if there's a leak, those kind of things, staining, but.
Well, there's kind of this fallacy of, if you get a roof and they say the shingles last 30 years, there's really no shingle that lasts truly 30 years, right? So 15 to 20 for like a standard shingle, or 20 to 25 for an architectural shingle. So knowing that roof is going to need some type of maintenance, before that 25-year period is up. So plumbing boots last about 5 to 7 years, roughly, right? So there's some permanent solutions for the plumbing boot, but most people don't have that.
And that's the vent pipe sticking out of the ceiling, out of the roof that most will see.
Yeah, that's where your plumbing is physically venting the methane out of the structure. So they do need some maintenance work, right?
Okay.
Just normal expansion and contraction could actually pull a roofing nail out. It can shift it back, which as the shingles get softer in the summertime, it can create a hole, which is a leak point.
Got it.
Right.
Okay. So do you guys see mold often with attics and issues there?
We do. Or? So a lot of times it's not generated from a leak. The root cause is typically from moisture forming in an attic system from a lack of proper ventilation. So attic temperature should always be comparable to outside temperature. Okay. If it gets too hot, you get too much humid air in that attic system, it cannot escape. You're going to start to form mold growth.
So what kind of ventilation should they, if I'm a homeowner or I'm someone and I'm just like, man, it's really mildewy up here, it doesn't smell, like what should I be looking out for?
So ventilation is, the theories have changed over the years. Back in the, probably the pre-60s, 50s, there was no ventilation.
Okay.
Gable vents came around, which are going to be basically, if you're looking at the side of the house all the way up towards the ridge of the roof, you're going to see openings, kind of like a louvered opening.
Got it.
But unless you're getting physical air movement, like windward air movement, the gable vents were never sufficient.
Okay.
So soffit vents are down low behind the gutter system at the eaves. and probably one of the better inventions was a ridge vent. So the ridge vent basically opens the very ridge of the roof. So when heat naturally rises up into the attic system, that's exactly right. So if you have a ridge vent, you have soffit vents, that heat as it goes out creates a natural draw, pulling air up through the soffit.
Okay.
So you do have that constant airflow. With a soffit to ridge system, most time you don't need like a powered vent or anything like that. So they're kind of dated a little bit.
The power vent would be the fan in the ceiling.
That's right. That's usually, no, that would be a whole house fan.
Oh, yeah.
So a power vent would be on the roof line. Most of the time they're thermostatically controlled. So once that temperature in the attic system reaches a certain point, then it pulls that air out.
Okay. Yeah. And you don't see those much anymore?
Not so much. I mean, a lot of the ones that we see now are solar powered.
Okay.
Right? So you're not wasting house power.
Okay.
So
what are some of the big things that people should be looking out for or addressing pretty quickly, yearly, annually, like toilets leaking, sinks? Like what kind of stuff should they look out for in their own house?
So most people really don't pay a whole lot of attention to their plumbing until they have an issue, right? So one of the things that we were just talking about was winterization, and winterizing pipe systems, and we can kind of get into that a little bit. But plumbing is used daily, right? So and you open your cabinets daily, so it should be pretty obvious if you
see a leak or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you don't know if like a toilet's leaking until you start seeing discoloration or staining on the ceiling below, right? Same thing with a tub. So it's not really an annual inspectable item.
Just
it's
something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, you're aware of. It's things that you touch every day. Same thing with electric. I mean, if electric's installed and if it's installed correctly, you really shouldn't have any issues, right? So you really don't get into issues until somebody else gets their hand in it that doesn't know what they're doing,
right? Or hairy homeowner changes their own outlet and fries the house,
right? So annual maintenance, which really would be biannual, would be HVAC is always important. It's something that we see that's neglected all of the time. And
just being serviced, or
that's exactly right. Yeah, and people don't understand, the longevity difference in the lifespan of an HVAC or a piece of mechanical equipment if it's maintained.
Okay.
So,
if I wanted it maintained, who would I?
So you could call a local. It depends on what you want to do. You could call a small, like mom and pop company, or you can call one of the bigger companies, or you can call like BG&E.
Okay.
So
and just say, hey, I want it serviced.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and typically they come out 2 times a year. Once before the cooling season, once before the heating season. So
what are they usually looking out for that?
Some of them, one of the bigger companies in the area has like a 129 inspection, a point inspection. So they'll clean it. They'll make sure your flame pattern is good. If your flame pattern's off, then there could be multiple reasons why that's occurring. If you have a heat exchanger, making sure the exchanger's good, things like that. All things that are important. Some obviously are safety related as well. So
I know a lot of people just neglect regular maintenance because they either don't know or they just don't want to do it, one or the other. I mean, what's some regular maintenance similar to HVAC that people should be doing?
As far as, just throughout
changing
the house.
Filters.
Yeah, so your filter. So we always advise people to buy the cheapest filter you can. Don't really kind of get sucked into buying a dense
crazy HEPA filter, this and the other.
Yeah. So the more dense the filter, the more airflow it restricts. And with some of the high efficiency furnaces now, it needs a ton of oxygen for combustion. And for efficient combustion. So if you get a dense filter, you're restricting that airflow. So, but if you're adamant about changing it every 30 days, cheap filter is the way to go. So we always tell people buy a case, of 12.
Amazon or something.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Yeah. What about on the exterior? What are some things, like you talked about water winterizing? Like what does that look like for someone? It's cold right now.
Right. So exterior caulking is always your best friend, right? So that's one of the things that's usually neglected as well. So inspecting or just looking at your caulking once a year doesn't mean you have to do it once a year.
Where at? Like on?
Around windows, around doors, any penetration points, things like that. So,
like it's cracking or?
So a lot of times, I'll give you an example. If you're in a brick elevation house, meaning that the exterior is brick, one of the most common areas for water penetration is around the windows.
Okay.
So around the brick sill, both sides of the windows, you are susceptible to water. So caulking will dry out and crack over time. Once it separates, now you've got an area for water. That's correct. So as far as winterizing like hose bibs, that's extremely important. I've been guilty of this myself.
Yeah.
I tell people that, 20 times a week, and
right.
I've let mine freeze before. So if you have a hose connected, disconnect your hose. Run the outside faucet, let water flow. Come inside, turn the inside valves off, leave the outside open so they can air dry.
Okay.
You won't have a problem at that point.
Okay.
So even if you are frost-free, if there's a frost-free bib on there, still winterize it.
Okay.
So because I've seen frost-free
still crack
they
and
crack.
Get a pipe or something.
And you'll know it as soon as you turn it back on. Right,
just explodes.
It
Just
will.
water everywhere.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
So
on the commercial side, what if someone's looking to start a business or buy a business or rent a space? Like, what are you guys looking out for there?
So it's a little bit different than the residential. Residential's pretty standard. Like even our fees are pretty standard, right? So commercial, we typically will put out a bid. We'll put out a proposal because I will go to the site first. I'll evaluate the building. So we do a range of 100,000 square foot building and structures down to a small dental office.
Oh,
right?
okay.
So this year, for some reason, we probably have done 10 to 15 churches.
Oh.
So and there's a lot of similarities, but when you getting into like a small commercial building, you could have multiple HVAC, or mechanical equipment. That's similar to a residential. But once we get into bigger structures, you're looking at chillers, massive, boiler systems, things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else that someone should go in with? Obviously, get an inspection, but
on a commercial side,
yeah, like what's something that could go wrong that someone may not have seen?
Well, a lot of times, even if you're leasing the space, depending on what your lease agreement says, some of the lease agreements will say you are responsible for
maintenance and everything.
That's
else.
exactly right. So we've done a lot of commercial buildings where the actual tenant doesn't even physically own the building, but is still responsible for things. So before they decide to make that purchase, we'll go in and evaluate those items. And it's kind of a la carte. It's a little bit different, like I said, than the residential side.
Okay.
So if they just want the mechanical side because that's all they're responsible for, we'll come in and we'll test it out and we'll evaluate it. And, give them ages of all their pieces of equipment. So, but it's similar on the interior side as far as basically outlets, plumbing, things like that. So there are some similarities there. Roof systems can be complex; they're a little bit different.
Rubber versus shingle.
Could be a membrane roof. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
and you'll see there's a lot in the city too, I guess, just residential roofs like that, right? Similar. Okay. So, I mean, if I'm walking into a house as a brand new buyer, right? You're walking through, you're checking all the outlets, you said, you're checking all the toilets to make sure that they're not shifted or leaking, right? Appliances, just making sure they're running. What else am I missing? Obviously the roof, basements.
Right. Yeah, so there's like, we follow a set standard, right? And it's a national standard. We always, and I've kind of pushed this with my team too, so we always kind of go a little bit beyond that standard. We test every appliance.
Right.
Okay. So I don't care if there's 3 in-law suites and there's 14 stoves in there, we're going to test them.
Right.
You know what I mean? So the way I look at it is if I was purchasing this property and it's coming with 3 stoves, I want to know if those stoves are operational. Right. So appliances are always big. We always test them. We photograph every aspect of the operation of that as well.
The reports are usually very detailed.
Yeah, absolutely. So every outlet that we can physically get to, every window that we can physically get to. We love it when places are vacant because then we can get to everything. Right. So there are times, though, where we've gone into where it was borderline like a hoarder situation. And you can't get to a whole lot. We're not
capped
doing
at that point at the knees.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
And we always tell our clients, look, if we can get this place, vacated out a little bit prior to you settling, we'll come back out and hit some areas that we couldn't before. Right?
Okay.
So basement is big for us, right? So especially depending on what type of foundation it is, if it's poured, you're less likely to have any water penetration. If it's block or stone or brick, you have a higher probability
Why?
of because it's porous. They're
Okay.
just very porous materials.
Just
So
attracts and holds water.
it does, and a lot of your exterior components play into that. So gutters, grating, downspouts. I know you've
Sure,
probably heard
yeah.
me talk about that.
Right.
You know,
Make sure they're away from the house.
that's exactly right. So you have to have a positive slope away from the structure, downspouts out and away, and making sure the gutter system is properly accumulating that water and getting it away from the structure as best as possible. So, a lot of times waterproofing companies will come in and just automatically push that waterproofing system where you may not need it.
Right. Could just be the grating. Could be the downspout.
Right. Yep. So
Right.
a lot of times we'll see water on a corner foundation, on the interior corner of the foundation. 90% of the time we go outside and
It's the
there's
issue.
a
It's the
downspout
grating.
right there. Yeah,
Right.
or a grade issue.
Okay.
So, my guys, we look at backside of drywall in a basement. We look for any signs of water staining that we possibly
Well, we've seen
can.
mold so many times on your reports of like you wouldn't know unless you threw a flashlight up on it.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So, dehumidification is important, with a block foundation or stone foundation. So, there's a lot of things that can help prevent those things, and most people just aren't aware of.
Right.
So when we walk in to do our evaluation, especially in a house where the owner hasn't been aware,
Sure.
we run into those issues.
So you guys do other testing as well, like radon. So
do.
what's radon for?
So radon is a natural gas that basically is coming out of this. It's coming out of the soil all around us. It can get concentrated in a structure, especially if the ground's saturated. If you have snowpack or we have heavy rain, then that gas can't naturally escape.
Yeah.
So you can have higher concentrations in a structure. There's certain areas in Maryland where radon levels are much higher than
Where would
others.
those be normally?
So if I can tell you, like once you get up towards the Pennsylvania line, that's
Significantly
usually
higher.
our highest. Yeah. So Baltimore City, in probably almost 20 years, I don't think I've ever had one fail.
That's
right.
good.
So once you get up towards that PA line, PA was
More rural areas.
That's exactly right. Pennsylvania was one of the original states. I think it was Pennsylvania and Utah were the two states where all of the radon testing was done, and the EPA standard was based off of that.
Okay, and the EPA standard is anything over 4.
That's right. So 4 picocuries, which is the unit of measurement. So that's the EPA threshold. Once you kind of get beyond that, then we suggest getting a mitigation system.
Do you generally recommend most people get an inspection on radon?
Yes, I do. Unless, let's say you called and you have a client and say they're buying a house down in Dundalk. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And very rare do we ever see it. But in Parkville, it's 50-50.
Okay.
So if you're up in Whitehall, I'd say 100%.
Right, yeah.
Falston, Jacksonville, those areas, up in the Hereford zone,
Okay.
things like that.
How do you
So
get rid of it?
the mitigation system is basically it is a PVC pipe, looks like a drain pipe,
Okay.
right, with a fan that physically pulls the gases out of the slab.
Okay.
They usually tie it into the sump pump because the sump is a path of least resistance for the gas.
Sure.
They seal the sump pump lid, and that fan creates that draw, and they take it up above the roof line.
Okay.
Right. So most of the houses now that are built probably in the past decade have a passive system already installed.
So what's the difference with the passive versus not?
So passive is just the pipe.
Okay.
Right.
It's just letting it flow.
That's just, yeah, absolutely. So the active system is the actual fan installation.
And the fan goes on the outside of the house, right?
It can go on the outside of the house. Some of the houses that they build today, they will rough in electric in the attic system.
Okay.
So because it's
Blow it out
installed
that way.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah. So
And you guys do other types of testing as well, right?
we do lead testing.
Okay.
We do water quality.
Why would I do a lead test?
We don't do too many during a real estate transaction.
Okay.
What we typically do, most of our lead testing is for rentals.
Okay.
So Baltimore County rentals, Baltimore City rentals. So
Where they require that it be done.
that's exactly right. For anything that was built prior to 78, then we do.
What are there's two different main types of lead tests, right? Or
There are. So there's a dust wipe, and then there is the XRF. So we don't have that capability. So, and if a client calls and says, "Hey, we want to go lead free," then we'll refer them out to someone
Got
else
it.
that has that XRF capability.
and
So
it's not always necessary.
not always necessary. No, at my rental properties, I've always done dust samples.
And for those that don't know, that's the X-ray, right? It's shooting. It's a gun basically. It
That's
looks
exactly
like a gun,
right.
and
And
it's
it can
shooting down into it.
That's right. Yeah, you can put it on the surface. It can tell you have lead paint 6 layers deep.
Right.
Right.
Which
So
the only way to encapsulate it is usually paint over it or
that's
remove
exactly
it, right?
Yeah. So
Most
encapsulation is the way to go.
Okay.
It's the best method.
What about like asbestos and stuff? You see that much?
So I used to be a state asbestos inspector, but we don't do that much because the requests are
It's few and far
minimal,
between.
right? Yeah. So there's building products out there that typically we can look at and say this probably has it based on the age of the property. I'll give you an example: floor tile. 9x9 floor tiles that were made by multiple different manufacturers back in the 50s and 60s.
And they look like almost little laminate tiles today.
They do. They're a little bit more rigid. But if we're kind of right in the heart of the high asbestos use, it could have been in cabinet adhesive. It could have been in flooring, ceiling tiles, exterior siding, roofing shingles. It was in so many building products. It was a fantastic building material.
Right. Just not safe.
Just not that good for your lungs, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
And you said something about water testing, right?
So we do water sampling. Yeah. So not if you're purchasing a house that is on city water, there's so much chlorine in city water. Really, there's no sense in doing a water quality sample. So, but if you're buying something that's on well, we always suggest doing a potability test. So, and that's the basic test is going to test for like bacteria, nitrates, pH, things like that. So, when I lived on in a house that had a well, I used to test mine annually. My pH would vary, and I could tell because some of the metal plumbing fixtures would start to get a little bit of corrosion.
Right? So if they see a lot of corrosion, or if they see a lot of like in their shower on the doors, like that corrosive, like the dirt.
It's usually
almost,
on the
right?
fixtures. Yeah, so it's on the fixtures itself, or like a metal valve, things like that. So discoloration in tubs and toilets, you may want to test for potability. If there's any smell.
What's a way to fix it?
So there's so many different treatments, and it is very specific. So
to the property,
very specific to what the actual issue is. So for pH, if your pH is off, they have neutralizers, they have water softeners, they have just so many different things that you can use.
And you'll usually make a recommendation to someone if it failed, like, hey, you may need XYZ, or
yes, yeah. So. And what we try to do is we make that recommendation because a lot of these water treatment companies, they'll come in and they'll sell you all of it. Right? So, and sometimes you don't need all of it. So we just you'll see the results. It comes directly from the lab. We'll kind of explain it to you. Hey, look, you might want to get a neutralizer because your pH is off a little bit. So.
And then, so like new construction, for instance, because that's been so big over the years, you guys usually do those inspections as well. Why would anyone get one on a new construction house?
You started smiling before you finished the question. So I would say probably annually we were doing about 250 new construction inspections a year. It's
quite a bit,
lot.
right?
Yeah. So the reason being is a house is made by man. None of us are perfect. Right.
There's room for error.
That's exactly. There's a ton of room for error. There's also expectations that a buyer has when purchasing a new construction home, that everything's going to be absolutely perfect.
No issues.
That's exactly right, and that's not the case. So you're susceptible to who your subs are too, as well, and who the employees of the subs are. So we have a good reputation with some of the superintendents and of some of the bigger track builders, just because we don't go in and point out the cosmetic things again. A lot of there's other inspection companies that'll point out all of those things, and that's not what we're there for. So,
now you'll do it in phases sometimes too, right?
We do. We'll do a pre-drywall phase, which is important. So we get to see what all of the roughing condition is. So the electrical, the plumbing, the HVAC. And insulation. So there's a very specific window that I like to get in there pre-drywall, and we always have that conversation. We remain pretty flexible because I guarantee that appointment will change 4 or 5 times. Based on hey, things got held up, they're a little behind, things like that. And then we'll do a pre-settlement inspection. And that's basically a full inspection. We like to get in there once they're done, almost to the point where
like a blue tape walkthrough.
Where they're going to do their walkthrough. We're going to be in there roughly the same time. So, and then the last one is we call it the 11-month warranty, before the builder, before their 1-year warranty
Yeah.
expires, we come back in and do a full inspection and say, and that way they have it documented.
Right.
So they can go back to the builder before the builder says, hey, we have no more responsibility here.
What are some things that you've seen where, I don't know, like top 3 things you see on a new build where something's gone wrong?
I can tell you probably during the pre-drywall phase, insulation. So
Just none?
There has been some where there has been none.
Right, okay.
Right? Yeah. So, but most of the time they may miss a few small things.
Okay.
But look, we've both lived in houses that were a little bit older. I know you've walked by an outlet where you can feel the cold air coming through. So that's something that we'll catch.
Okay.
So that doesn't happen. The insulators are there for a very short period of time, and they're in and out pretty quickly.
Right.
So
On to the
that's
next
why
one.
we like to get in after insulation is done before drywall gets up. So because the insulation seems like it's one of those areas where they can miss a few things. So
Okay.
from a structural standpoint, it's funny when we do a pre-drywall, I can usually see the superintendents or whoever the supervisor is. I can usually see their markings where, hey, this has got to be cut and got to be sistered, things like that.
Okay.
So, yeah, and they'll
Just
we'll be
making
able to-
sure it was actually
That's
done.
exactly right. Yeah. So. For pre-settlement, we're basically looking at all of the same things that we're looking at during a real estate transaction. So we're going to test everything.
Yeah.
So the only difference being is appliance packages sometimes, are depending on if the buyer's responsible for it, if the builder puts it
Sure.
in, right? But they usually won't touch anything appliance related. They'll
Okay.
go directly to the manufacturer.
Gotcha.
Right. So,
Okay.
but most of the time, if we call out system-related issues, the builders will fix 100% of it.
Right.
So,
And the last 2 years, a lot of people weren't getting inspections with all the craziness. Thankfully, we're getting back to more normalcy. But I know there's a lot of calls you get after the fact of like, oh, my tub's leaking through the ceiling, and it's, did you fix it? Because I flagged it.
Right.
And it's like, no.
yeah.
And then, they want to blame you versus
Right.
fixing the problem.
Well, we kind of go back to the appliances where I said we take a lot of photographs. We did get a call a couple of years ago where a guy said my stove wasn't working, and there was a photograph of the stove being operational in the report. That's one of the reasons why.
Right.
So things happen. It's just the nature of mechanical equipment and things like that. So, if there is a problem, we always will go back out and say, hey, look, this was documented. I can point you in the right direction of where to go.
Right. And just guide them where who they need to fix it.
Luckily, we don't have
Right.
we
Too
don't
many
get
of them.
Too many of those things. So I will tell you probably the biggest thing, and this, Josh, is investment properties.
Oh, yeah. The lipstick flips.
Yeah, and I will tell anyone to do their due diligence. Right now, it's easy to pull permits online, so you can see whether or not permits were pulled by going directly to the local jurisdiction's website.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, that's a big thing because most of them don't even pull permits. They just throw
don't.
things in and say, move on.
Exactly right. So, my guys, we can tell within 5 minutes of being in a property that they didn't pull permits.
Right.
Right. So, and here's the thing about that: if you didn't pull permits, all right, that was on you. All
right.
But if you did everything to standard and everything correctly,
Most buyers are okay with it.
they're okay with it. Right. Absolutely. It's just where you get into, the electrical wasn't brought to standard, plumbing wasn't done correctly.
Right.
It's just small things and code changes, even like HVAC or anything
Right.
like that. So, why should that new buyer be responsible for especially if an investor did it, why should that new buyer be responsible for all that stuff?
Right.
So, and what they get into is, let's say they want to put a pool in the backyard and they go to pull a permit, and
Then they check all the other
and
ones.
they check some of the other stuff.
Right.
So
Well, I'm sure we can go into all the horror stories maybe on another one for sure because there's a lot of them, and you guys get them all the time.
all the time.
But that's probably a wrap for today. And where can people find your info?
You can go to veteraninspectiongroup.com, Veteran Inspection Group on Instagram. Same thing with Facebook.
And your other inspectors are also former military or
We're all
current
veterans.
Marine.
We have 2 jarheads and 1 Army.
Right.
And we try not to make too much fun of each other.
Right.
So,
Well, that's fair. But you're also very meticulous with things, which is
It's attention
the key
to detail.
thing.
Yeah,
I mean, especially with this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, you can check Steve's website out. You can give him a call, Veteran Inspection Group. And if you guys have any questions for us, 410-638-9555. Thanks, man.
Absolutely. Thank you.